And hello, everybody. Yeah, my name is Kelly Ash, senior researcher. A little bit about myself. I grew up in Hancock, Minnesota. I saw there were some folks saying that they're from Morris, Minnesota, so grew up just 8 miles from there. And then currently live in New London, Minnesota, which again, I saw a couple folks say they're from New London, and I think I would feel terrible if I didn't mention that this weekend, this Saturday, we have some mobile sauna units coming in at our local brewery to have some fun with sauna and beer and maybe take a dip in the river. So if anybody's got some free time on Saturday, come visit New London. So we'll leave it at that. So yeah, State of Rural, something we do every year. It's always just a quick kind of what we would call data dump. All the new data that's been published up until the end of 2024, we put it all together and just look at those trends. Here are some of the main kind of segments that you'll see if you go and look at a report. We're just going to pull out a few highlights today. We're not going to go into all of this, but a few interesting tidbits. It is important to understand that there's always a data lag with this stuff. So it's 2025 in January, right? And every time we look at data, we want to think that's what's happening right now. But keep in mind that that's probably about 2 years old. This data that I'm going to show was collected in 2023 and was published in 2024. So the data is still a year or two old. So keep that in mind as we're looking through things, particularly now that we're getting past the pandemic. The data is 3 years after that now, which is always interesting to see if some of these trends are sticking. I'm going to show quite a few charts, and I use this kind of categorizations just so folks know how I'm defining things. You could take a look at whatever county you're in. Are you defined as entirely rural, town-rural mix, urban, town-rural mix, or entirely urban? If you're interested in how these categorize, this taxonomy is defined, feel free. The state demographer actually created this taxonomy, and I just really like to use it because it gets that nice kind of all those different categories. You know, we want to split everything is either rural or urban, but in reality, most things are somewhere in between that. And I feel like this taxonomy kind of tries to capture that a little bit. And so that's what we're going to be using here on out. So let's start with people. Aging populations in rural areas impacting natural population change. So what do we mean by natural population change? So we always look at population numbers and we see them up and we see them come down, and we don't really sometimes think about what goes into the up and downs of it, right? Well, there's two components of population change. There's natural change, so that's looking at births minus deaths. And then there's migration change, which is looking at the number of people coming in versus the number of people leaving your county, your city, whatever geographic unit you're using. This first piece, we're going to look at natural change, because this is actually the big piece, and actually historically has been the biggest primary change agent in population change. Everybody always wants to talk about migration, but natural change has typically been where population changes have had the most significant impact. And what's happening in rural areas, and actually in Minnesota as a whole, but it's more severe in our rural areas, is that aging populations are becoming a much larger piece of the puzzle in population change than births are. That's why the elderly stick figure is quite a bit larger than the small baby stick figure. So this chart kind of is looking at all this stuff and how it is playing out. The red line going across is the number of deaths in each of those aggregate county units. The blue line is the number of births aggregated in those county units. And then the black line is just like if we take the number of births, subtract the number of deaths. That's what the black values mean, and the black line there. And so you can see in our entirely rural areas, they have been, for the most part, dealing with more deaths than births for quite a while now, but it's been not as severe until about 2020, 2021, 2022. This decade is when we're really starting to see it, where there's a lot more deaths and births are starting to decline as well. And so we're seeing a pretty big gap there. And so if you look at that black line, natural change, you can see about 545 population decline due to there being more deaths than births in our entirely rural areas. And this trend isn't going to change. This is the probably key story we're going to see over the next 10 to 20 years as that baby boomer generation continues to age. The first part of the baby boomers are just now turning 75, typically when you start to see death rates increase. And so that's just what we're going to be dealing with moving forward. And everybody's dealing with this. So even town-rural mix, you can see they used to have more births than deaths, and now this decade that's switched where there's more deaths than births. urban town rural mix, a very similar pattern where they had significantly more births than deaths. But now deaths has really started to increase and births has dropped a little bit. And so they're about breaking even essentially. And then our entirely urban counties, they've had significantly more births than deaths ongoing. But you could see that gap is also starting to close a little bit. So all of Minnesota is dealing with this, this kind of fact of natural change. But how it plays out, depending on how rural or urban you are, does change it quite a bit. So if we have this happening, where essentially you have you have this uphill battle that rural areas are having to fight against, which is population decline due to more deaths and births, then you're hoping that you can try to make up some of that through in-migration. And honestly, that's been something that's been surprising, and it continues to surprise us into the so far this decade. So this chart shows, again, those county aggregate taxonomy categories. And the purple line is international net migration. So if it's above 0, that means you're having more international people coming from other countries immigrating into your counties than leaving to other countries. And then there's domestic migration, which is typically the larger portion of all of this. And that's the kind of green line there. And then the black line, again, is if you essentially, what's the net? If you sum these things together, what do we end up having? And what's interesting, these are trend lines, so let's keep this in mind. If you look at the actual raw data, it's a little bit more jagged up and down. But so I just took trend lines so we could see this a little bit easier. But there's a pretty common theme here. And it's something we started to notice, particularly in 2016, 2017, is that our more rural areas of Minnesota typically had a growing net out-migration, particularly domestic out-migration. So the number of people leaving was increasing. But starting around, like particularly after the Great Recession, that started to kind of plateau and all of a sudden started to improve to the point where when we got to 2017, 2018, in some of those years, we started to see our rural counties start to see more people in-migrating than out-migrating. So you had a net in-migration, which is a very interesting turnaround in trends that continued. I think the 2020 and the pandemic really kind of intensified that trend. And we're continuing to see it as we move forward. So town-rural mix, a very similar story. Even urban town-rural mix, they were having a net domestic in-migration, hit that Great Recession. They weren't doing so hot population-wise for migration, and then a really good improvement since then. The interesting one, right, is entirely urban. This is one that a lot of people talk about is what's going on in our most urban counties. You know, are people leaving them? What's this look like? And you can see there, you know, they've been having a domestic in-migration for quite a while, particularly during the Great Recession, we saw it go up. But then, they, you know, since like kind of 2016, 2017 timeline, they've actually been getting more towards a net out migration. And you can see by 2020, it was a pretty solid out migration. These are trend lines again. But that is what we're continuing to see. You know, next year is another year. We'll see if those trends continue. They are, I will say, if you look at the raw data, less intense now than they were during the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see what next year looks like. Now, the other interesting thing when we look at those urban counties is that we have urban counties, both suburbs. We have Hennepin-Ramsey, which is kind of the inner core urban, and then we have urban counties out in greater Minnesota as well. And so I wanted to split those up and be like, okay, are they actually all following this trend line? And what's interesting is that the suburbs in greater Minnesota, entirely urban counties, follow a very similar trend line. That during the coming up to the Great Recession, they kind of had a pretty significant worsening in terms of their migration. And then they've been seeing some really nice improvement since then. Whereas Hennepin and Ramsey actually has kind of struggled with their net domestic in-migration for a long time now. During the Great Recession, they improved quite a bit, but they've been kind of going down ever since then as well. What has typically held Hennepin and Ramsey together to have continuous population increases through those years was both international migration, which was very robust for them, as well as that natural change. They just have so many more births than deaths in Hennepin and Ramsey that keeps their population going. So kind of some interesting nuance there. We're going to be having a full breakdown on migration trends in the next month here or so. I'm working hard on that. Whenever I get healthy again, I'll get back on that and hopefully crank that out later in February. So keep an eye out for that. So what this all adds up to, natural change, migration change, we have all these things adding up to population change. And what's been interesting is that so far this decade, we're seeing a lot better population numbers. You know, if we want to put a lot of weight into where a population is, then yeah, this decade has been quite a bit better. In fact, in 2019, 46 counties had a lower population in 2019 than they did in 2010. So far this decade, from 2020 to 2023, only 21 counties, so about half of those counties have less population in 2023 than they did in 2020. So again, some really interesting things happening. I think a lot of folks in Greater Minnesota really feel this. They see it. They're talking about it a lot. And the data is really kind of continuing to back up those feelings and insights. And again, this is early. You know, we're only 3 years into this decade. But these are positive signs. So. BIPOC populations, so our Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations continue to grow in rural Minnesota. It's something that sometimes gets overlooked, I feel. Here's just two maps looking at the percentage of the population that's BIPOC in 1980 compared to 2023, and you can see a lot of change occurring, particularly in southern Minnesota, where you're seeing a lot of robust change there. And actually, the county with the highest percentage of BIPOC population in the entire state is Nobles County in southwest Minnesota, with right around 50%. So let's talk a little bit about economics. This is something a lot of folks always take a look at. And a lot of times, rural areas, we try to compare them with urban areas in terms of earnings and wages. So let's just kind of dig into that a little bit, because there is a lot of nuance there. So the chart on the left here shows earnings per capita. So that's the total earnings divided by the population in those county categories. And you'll see the big gap between our entirely urban counties versus all the other county categories, right? And that gap just persists. It really doesn't get a whole lot better. It seems to just stay pretty consistent. However, what's interesting is if we look at the earnings per capita index, so looking at where it's been since 2001, we see a kind of really interesting story, right? Where actually the largest earnings growth has actually occurred in our entirely rural counties with 153%. Our town-rural mixed counties, 135%, 124% for our urban-town-rural mix, and then our entirely urban is 110% with the lowest. So one thing I think that's important when anybody's trying to gauge the healthiness or robustness of rural wages, earnings, and maybe even the economy in general is look at growth. Don't always just compare the value points, because honestly, if we're going to try and catch up to our entirely urban counties, we're talking about earnings growth of 250 to 350%, which is probably unreasonable, maybe just flat out like unrealistic. And so we tend to always look at what does the growth look like? Is it still robust? Are we still kind of holding our own? And the answer is yes. And not everything's perfect. Like I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything's rosy with wages and earnings and people are, flying high in rural areas. But we are continuing to see good growth. And that's just another good sign that, you know what, we're holding our own. Things are going okay. We're not so far seeing any huge changes there. A lot of folks are always interested in what's the kind of industry makeup and employment. And you could pretty much guess or tell anyone it's going to be educational services, healthcare, and social assistance. So even in places that might be dominated by agriculture in our rural area. So if you're driving from Hancock to Morris, you see a lot of corn and soybeans, things like that. You would think, man, everybody here probably works for agriculture-linked activities. That's actually probably not true. It's probably going to be educational services and healthcare and social assistance. It's not to say these things aren't important, all the other industries, but there's just typically always is one dominant industry across Minnesota. But I did just break it down by entirely rural, and you could in those categorizations, and you could see educational services is number one across the entire rank, and number one. Manufacturing solidly number two across all those county categories. And then we start to see some interesting changes, right? So the more rural you are, the more you might be into extractive industries such as agriculture, forestry, mining, things like that. And then retail trade pops up for our other county groups, and then you get into the professional and business services in our entirely urban areas. Construction pops up at number 4, arts recreation at number 5. It's you do see some pretty good diversity in the industry makeup there, which is great to see. Rural areas tend to have a higher percentage of workers employed in government or as sole proprietors. This one's always kind of interesting to me. So the link of the chart on top just looks at the percentage of jobs that are in government there. And you can see it's about 16% for entirely rural counties, closer to 10% the more urban you get. Why is there such a higher percentage in our rural areas? Well, it's just matter of fact economies of scale. So government services still have to be provided no matter how many people are located in a particular county. So it just tends to be that you're going to have a higher percentage of folks that are working in government because those services still need to be provided. Non-employer, self-employed as a percentage of total jobs. If you're wondering what that means, if you get a 1099, a lot of folks are 1099ers out there, that means you're a sole proprietor or a non-employer, self-employed. So you're a part of the statistic. I kind of like this chart because what's interesting is that if we were to take those jobs and just look at, okay, how does that compare to the number of jobs that aren't non-employer, more typical employed jobs? It's about 25% in our rural counties. This is a very interesting kind of fact. If you're an economic developer working in a rural area, probably not a group of people or individuals that you think a lot about. So if you are an economic developer in a rural area, maybe reach out and try and figure out, like, do 1099ers need a different type of service or tool set that is atypical of more, employer style economic development tools. So take a look at that. We have the map in the report too that shows kind of which counties in particular have really high percentages, and you'll find most of them to be in northern Minnesota. Wages meeting the cost of living vary significantly across Minnesota. So we talk about this a lot at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. Again, trying to get away from that comparing just wages to wages in urban areas. We also, because we do that because we say wages are some sort of indicator as someone's ability to make a living, right? To meet the cost of living. But then we also then have to include what is the cost of living in that area, because there is a lot of variation in the cost of living across Minnesota, particularly around housing is probably the biggest variable factor in the cost of living between urban and rural areas. So we took a look at median wages as a percent of the cost of living in 2023. And you can see, obviously Hennepin Ramsey is still pretty high. You see some kind of more 150, 175% across some of those more rural regions, 125 to 150%. But then there's really this one really distinct area in the Central Lakes region and north of the Twin Cities that, for as long as I've looked at this data, has always had lower wages and higher costs of living. And so folks that are in that region, you could probably feel this a little bit more. You tend to probably have a little bit harder of a time where median wages really doesn't seem to equate to making up the full cost of living. I think this is the last two slides here. So we've been talking about job vacancies for a long time at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. I'm sure you folks in rural areas have been thinking about this or seeing it, hearing about it. And so here's the most recent data. This is 2023 data now. You can see we've had job vacancy rates increasing since 2010. Again, right around 3-4% is what we consider to be a healthy job vacancy rate. If you're above that, it's going to get pretty difficult for employers to find employees, to find a labor pool to have fun with. And so everybody's still above that, but we have come down from those severe highs of 2021 where we had in Northeast Minnesota, I think it was 9.8% job vacancy rate, which is absolutely bonkers. And so we've come down from those highs, but still really, really high, around 6%, 6.5% in greater Minnesota. The 7-county metros high as well, but they're lower than everybody else at 4.6%. So job vacancy rates, still a thing. Searching for labor force, still a problem, and significantly more severe in greater Minnesota. A lot of folks will always say, well, if they would just increase wages, this problem would be made up. And the problem is that wages actually have been going up quite a bit. This is in response to job vacancies, employers feeling like, okay, we have to increase wages to try and get our applicant pool to be a little bit larger, as well as minimum wage policies that have been implemented since 2005 to 2016 is when a lot of those kind of hit. That made a difference as well. So what's happened is since job vacancies in greater Minnesota have been so much more severe, that gap that used to exist between 7-county metro and greater Minnesota, the gap of median wages of job vacancies, you can see has really closed. And actually, the 7-county metro was pretty stagnant there for a while because they really weren't feeling the job vacancy, labor force shortage as much as greater Minnesota was until about 2017. And then we really started to see where the job vacancy rate went up in the 7-county metro. That's when the wages went up as well. And so really, really interesting to see. So those are just some brief highlights from the report. Go check it out on our website, ruralmn.org. You can find a lot more breakdowns. Of course, if you have any other questions after you read it, please let us know. I know, Julie, you were kind of watching. Were there any questions that came up?
The biggest question, one was asked about average or median on data, and most of it said on the slide it was median.
Yeah, so it will say on the slide, if it's median wages, it'll say on the slide. The one you're probably interested in is the earnings per capita. So the earnings per capita, that was all the earnings in a county added together. So every household that had earnings, summed it all together and then divided by the population. So not a good representation if there's a county where there's like 3 people had all the money and no one else did, right? And so that's something to absolutely keep in mind when you're looking at data. Great question. I'm guessing you're a data person. That's something to keep in mind when looking at that stuff.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. Again, if you do have questions throughout this whole day, please let us know. And like Kelly said, you can find our State of Rural and all of our reports at our website at ruralmn.org. And a reminder that all of our research, everything that we do is free for you to use. And please use it as you see fit with grants and different applications. That's what the information is here for. All right, we do have a couple questions here before we move on. Is net migration in Minnesota similar to the rest of the United States?
Good question, Jack. No, it is not. If we were to kind of parcel out the United States into different regions, we're very similar to what we call Frost Belt. So kind of upper Midwest, very challenging migration numbers for all of us. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska typically are having a tough time keeping people in our states. We tend to lose more than we can bring in, and that is a pretty harsh reality that we're facing. But then there's states like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, where probably a lot of these folks are going to, they're doing really, really well. They see hardcore net in-migration. And so that's really kind of how we're seeing that flow of migration happening. So no, we are not like the rest of the United States. We are much like the upper Midwest in terms of those, I would call, flows of people.
Days like today, I can appreciate people moving to Arizona. It's really cold and windy and snowy out. I can appreciate that. Couple more questions. Dawn has a question. For government jobs, would those jobs include all public schools, counties, cities, and public health care?
It's a great question. And Marnie, I might have to turn this over to you. I do know it includes counties, cities, and public health care. Public schools, that one I'm always get a little tripped up on.
I believe that falls under the education
That's what I thought,
yeah.
That was my guess too. I've tried to read these definitions every year, so I'm updated on it, but that's been one I haven't checked in on lately. But I think you're right, yes.
Okay. And then we have one more question from Beth. Will the stopping of data share from the federal level change this report in the future?
Oh, great question. And actually, it was something I was debating on whether I should put in this slideshow or not. We've already had some changes in our report, so any of you that have followed our report, over the last 5, 6 years, you may have noticed some changes in this year's report, particularly around, I'm trying to remember which one. So there was a lot of data we used to get about agriculture that was from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, as well as industry makeup. So you will have noticed in prior years, we had the top employment map be a lot more colorful because we were better able to measure how many jobs were in agriculture and some other types of jobs that aren't covered in the typical jobs data that we get from DEED. So in that DEED data, you have to be in the unemployment insurance program. A lot of agriculture linked and other types of industries that are prominent in some of our rural counties aren't covered in the unemployment insurance program and so aren't covered in that data set. We used to supplement with the Bureau of Economic Analysis some data and try to meld these two together to try and get a better I'd say, more accurate picture of what our employment makeup looked like in rural Minnesota. And that data is no longer available due to budget constraints and just kind of reprioritization. So that's too bad, and that's really, really harsh, but it's a reality that we're facing now. And, you know, with some of the stuff going on in the United States, it's something we need to keep a pretty good eye on, because without this data, I just don't know how we can have good policy conversations about some of this stuff. I mean, we at the Center for Rural Policy Development really rely on data that's publicly available and open to us. And being able to break things down at geographic levels, at race and ethnicity, is really important, because, as you probably looked at that map, we have really concentrated populations of people in certain spots that, you know, the policies are going to look different for those counties. So great question. It's something we're keeping an eye on. It's already impacted us. We don't know what that's going to look like in the future.
Just a couple more questions before we move on. Erica is asking, does CRPD do any projection reports? And right now we have not. Do you think maybe in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's always going to depend on what the policy issue is. So we did do some projections once, just looking at labor force numbers. But honestly, all of that data is already available. The state demographer in Minnesota is absolutely fabulous. Probably one of the best offices, state demography offices in the entire United States. And they're so good about keeping an eye on rural places in rural Minnesota. So kudos to them. They do great population projections that is broken down not only by gender, but age, and I think race and ethnicity for some counties, not all counties, because of margin of error issues. But they do great work around that. And then Indeed also has some data available looking at projected labor force numbers, as well as looking at demands for types of occupations into the future. So they do a lot of that work. We will draw in that data when we need to on certain topics, but you know, we don't do it so much in this report.
One more question, and I like this one because it's dealing with brain gain, I think. Is the inward domestic migration for rural town people that once moved away and are now coming back, or people not originally of those communities?
Yeah, this would be a great question for Ben Winchester at the University of Minnesota Extension. He talks a lot about this, and he kind of started, I think, a pretty robust movement in Minnesota of people looking at this issue and talking about, you know, who's coming into our rural counties. And, you know, he will indicate that one is typically 30 to 49-year-olds, which I think even during the pandemic, we could probably hold that that's still true. And I'm trying to remember, they did some research. So if you Google brain gain, University of Minnesota Extension, you'll find a survey that they did of newcomers that have moved to rural areas, trying to find out, one of the questions they asked was, were you from this region before? Did you previously live in this region? And I think it's somewhere around 40%, 35 to 40% were actually from the region, meaning all the other newcomers, so the 60 to 65%, weren't from that region, which is kind of a surprising fact. I think a lot of folks tend to think that it's people that graduate from the high school or something like that. But, you know, if you're in particularly a touristy area, it might be people that, you know, were just at one point tourists in the area, just kind of fell in love with it, maybe came and camped there every year as a family, things like that. You'll see interesting connections that way.
So I often like to remind people when people say, oh, rural is dying, it is not.
No.
It is not. It really, not at all. And it depends upon the part of state you're in, but rural is doing quite well.
Yeah, it's resilient. It has been for 60, 70 years. You know, we haven't had I don't know, last time I looked, I think since 1950, we've lost maybe 5 towns that have dissolved.
Yeah, resiliency is the word. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. Thank you for your questions. Please keep them coming in. We are going to move on to our next topic and stay with Kelly here. But one of the big topics that he talked about is talking about our aging population and what does that mean. And so we're going to be covering rural nursing facilities and what does that look like for workforce, for beds in nursing homes, for skilled nursing. So I'll turn it back over to you.